Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Ma ba'd. Carrying on. So we began talking about the different salahs and what Imam Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi is suggesting we do before each one of these salah, and how or we should spend that time in between one salah until the next. So we reached Salatul Asr. So he says, وَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَن تَكُونَ أَوْقَاتُكَ مُهْمَلَةً فَتَشْتَغِلَ فِي كُلِّ وَقْتٍ بِمَا اتَّفَقَ كَيْفَ اتَّفَقَ بَلْ يَنْبَغِي أَن تُحَاسِبَ نَفْسَكَ. So this is where we left off. So we began talking about how the scholars, they stress the fact that a person should have some sort of a routine, some sort of a schedule when it comes to their acts of worship. So Imam Ghazali is saying the exact same thing, that a person should not leave their time empty to perform whatever worship whenever they want to perform it. He goes, that's not the better way to do it. He says, rather, a person should calculate and they should plan out their day and they should space out their worship throughout the entire day. And a person, he says, وَتُرَتِّبَ وَظَائِفَكَ فِي لَيْلِكَ وَنَهَارِكَ. A person should appoint specific amounts that they want to complete during the day and during the night. He says this will help you complete and achieve your goals when it comes to your acts of worship. Otherwise, it is very possible, right, that a person has a plan to recite Quran, right, but they become busy in something else, and then they don't get to read Quran that day. A person wants to read a book, right, acquire some knowledge of deen, but a person does not get the opportunity to do that. So now if a person, for example, has half an hour, and they're spreading this half an hour, rather they're splitting this half an hour, right, into different sections, that for 10 minutes of the half an hour, I'm going to recite Quran. And then after those 10 minutes are done, I'm going to read a book. And after that, I'm going to conclude with some extra rak'ah, or some optional prayer. And so this is, he said, this is better. He says, وَتُعَيِّنَ لِكُلِّ وَقْتٍ شُغْلًا لَا يَتَعَدَّاهُ وَلَا تُؤْثِرُ فِيهِ سِوَاهُ. He says you should appoint a specific act of worship for each moment of the day, that at this time I'm going to do this, at this time I'm going to do this. For example, after Fajr, I'm going to sit and recite the Holy Quran. After Asr Salah, I'm going to sit and read a book. After Maghrib Salah, I'm going to engage in some optional prayers, some nawafil. So like this, a person has these specific goals in mind. La yata'addahu, they should not skip this and do anything else. وَلَا تُؤْثِرُ فِيهِ سِوَاهُ. They should not give any other act of worship preference during that time. At that time, that is the only act of worship that they are doing. He says this way, you will have goals in your head of what amount of worship you want to complete, and it'll become easy for you to achieve those goals. Otherwise, what ends up happening is, we discussed this last week, that a person becomes busy. Right now, for example, if a person does not have a specific amount that they're going to read, right, sometimes it's possible that a person just continues reading and reading and reading. Now, he's not saying that this is bad. He's saying, but it's better if a person spreads out the good. Some salah, right? Some reading, right? Some recitation of the Holy Quran, right? So they spread out the good. So he says that that's better. He says, فَبِهِ تَظْهَرُ بَرَكَةُ الْأَوْقَاتِ. He goes through this, right? The barakah and the blessings of a person's time, it will begin to show. فَأَمَّا مَنْ تَرَكَ نَفْسَهُ مُهْمَلًا سُدًا إِهْمَالَ الْبَهَائِمِ لَا يَدْرِي بِمَا يَسْتَقْبِلُ كُلَّ وَقْتٍ فَتَنْقَضِي أَكْثَرُ أَوْقَاتِ ضَائِعَةً. He says that if we begin living like animals, right, that there's no specific thing that they're going to do at a specific time. Rather, the animal just lives its life. Whatever happens, the animal just does. He says, if you begin living your life like this, he says that majority of the time what's going to happen is that a full day will pass and you'll realize at the end of the day that I wasted this day. I wanted to do this, I wasn't able to do this. I wanted to do this, I wasn't able to do this. I wanted to do this, I wasn't able to do this. So he says, if you don't have these goals in mind, if you don't know exactly what you're supposed to be doing, he says, then life will move on and you will become busy in other things. And in the end, you won't be able to spend your time in that act of worship that you wanted to. So he says, it's always a better idea to have a specific act of worship for a specific time. He says, وَأَوْقَاتُكَ عُمْرُكَ وَعُمْرُكَ رَأْسُ مَالِكَ وَعَلَيْهِ تِجَارَتُكَ. Imam Ghazali, he says that the time that you spend, he says your time is your life. Right? That by each ticking moment, each minute that goes by, each hour that goes by is your life going by. And you are getting closer and closer to your grave, he says. He says, and what is your life? He says, وَعُمْرُكَ رَأْسُ مَالِكَ. He says, and your life is your capital, meaning it's the initial investment. It's what you're going to cash in the hereafter. That look, this was my life. This is the amount of good I did throughout my life. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you accordingly. So he says that's the capital that you're going to take in the hereafter. وَعَلَيْهِ تِجَارَتُكَ. And he says that is what your trade is based upon. That's how you trade with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That I spent this much time in your worship of Allah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remunerate you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will give you back. وَبِهِ وُصُولُكَ إِلَى نَعِيمِ الْأَبَدِ فِي جِوَارِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And he says, by passing this life in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by reaching the akhirah in a state of obedience, he says you will reach eternal bliss, right? Eternal bounties, fi jiwarillahi ta'ala, right? In the company of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That person will be in Jannah forever. فَكُلُّ نَفَسٍ مِّنْ أَنفَاسِكَ جَوْهَرٌ لَا قِيمَةَ لَهُ. He says that each and every single one, right, of a person, a human being, every single breath a person takes is priceless. He says, Jawharun la qimata lahu. It's so unique and it's priceless. It's a priceless jewel, he says. Jawhar, it's a jewel, la qimata lahu, that has no price. It's priceless. Right? No one can purchase time from you. Right? Time is priceless. Nothing can purchase time. He says, time is the only thing that a person will never be able to get back. A person will never be able to get back. A person becomes old. A person can wish all they want. Layta shababa ya'udu yawman. The poet says, Ala layta shababa ya'udu yawman fa ukhbiruhu bima fa'ala al-mashibu. The poet says that, if only youth would come back to me, then I would tell youth what old age has done to me. Meaning now I'm old. And now a person can wish all they want, right? That the strength that they had when they were young, right? The courage that they had when they were young, right? The health that they had when they were young can come back, but it's never going to come back. It's priceless. He says your life is priceless. Every breath, every single breath a person takes is priceless. He says because there's no substitute. There's nothing that you can get in exchange for it. Everything else in this world you can exchange something for. Everything. Right? Everything you can exchange something for. Everything has a substitute. Right? Everything has a substitute. He says the only thing that has no substitute is time. Once time goes, time will never come back. But once time goes, it's never going to come back. فَإِذَا فَاتَ فَلَا عَوْدَةَ لَهُ. He says that when time passes, فَلَا عَوْدَةَ لَهُ. It's never going to return. The day will go by. Right? Umar bin Abdul Aziz is saying, Al-waqtu kas-sayf lam taqta'hu qata'aka. That time is like a sword. If you don't use it to cut, it will cut you. The time will pass. Time will pass, and a person will be wondering where this time has gone. Imam Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh, he's not mentioning this over here, right? But it is among the signs of the day of judgment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, towards the day of judgment, there'll be very less barakah and blessings in time. A person will feel like days will go by like moments. But this is the case with us today. Right? Can a person imagine? Right? Can a person imagine, right, that, just for example, let's say 10, maybe 15 years ago, this masjid was not here. And now the masjid is here. Now it's like we can never remember a time that the masjid was not here. It's been like, it's been forever, the masjid is here. A person can never recall that time. It's been 2 years and we've been living in this COVID era. Already 2 years. Right? Time is, right, how they say in English, time flies. Right? But time flying is something that is considered to be from among the signs of the day of judgment. Right? That a person, right, will have no barakah, no blessings left in their time. Right? If we look at the people of the past, sometimes we hear stories of people of the past, right, that they used to perform this much worship in one night. Now we think to ourselves, that's impossible. Very famous, right? Mis'ar ibn Qidam, a very famous tabi'i. It is mentioned with regards to him, Ibn Hajar Haythami, he mentions in his biography of Imam Abu Hanifa, he says that this tabi'i, Mis'ar, he traveled to Baghdad to see Abu Hanifa, right? Because he heard about him. So he traveled, and it's mentioned that when he reached Baghdad, he saw that Abu Hanifa was a man who was very busy, that he used to teach every single day. After Fajr Salah, he would begin teaching, and he would teach until right before Dhuhr. And then he would rest a bit. And then after Dhuhr, he would teach until Asr. After Asr, he will teach until Maghrib. After Maghrib, he would teach until Isha. So Mis'ar says that I began wondering that, when does Abu Hanifa spend time worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When does he do that? He's teaching all day. So he says that I noticed one thing, that Abu Hanifa is always the last person to leave the masjid. So he says, okay, so one day I decided to stay and I'm going to watch. What is Abu Hanifa doing? And what is Abu Hanifa doing? So he says that I stayed and I noticed that when everyone leaves, right, according to some versions of the story, it's mentioned that Abu Hanifa also leaves and then he comes back when everyone leaves. So no one knows that Abu Hanifa is there. So he comes back and he starts performing Salah. Mis'ar said that I fell asleep waiting for Abu Hanifa to finish. And Abu Hanifa did not finish. He says, when I woke up in the morning, Fajr time, I noticed Abu Hanifa was there. But it was still possible that Abu Hanifa left that night and he came back. Maybe he went home, he went to sleep. And I fell asleep too. And now he's just here back in the morning for Fajr. So he says, I need to make sure I stay awake. So he comes back the next day and he makes sure that he stays awake. He says, Wallahi, I watched Abu Hanifa the entire night. Abu Hanifa stood the entire night in Salah. He says the entire night. And he even mentions that Abu Hanifa, he would get tired of standing. So sometimes I would see him, he would lean a bit to the right on his right foot, on his right leg. And then he would get tired, he would lean on his left. And then he would lean back on his right. And then he would lean back on his left. Mis'ar says that I stayed in the company of Abu Hanifa for approximately 25 years. He says for 25 years, Abu Hanifa performed Fajr Salah with the wudu of Isha. For 25 years. So he began mentioning the story to everyone. One of Abu Hanifa's famous students, Qazi Imam Abu Yusuf, He mentions, right, that what are you talking about? I spent 40 years with Abu Hanifa. For 40 years, Abu Hanifa has been performing Fajr Salah with the wudu of Isha. For 40 years. And it's mentioned that Abu Hanifa used to finish one entire Quran every single night. And during the holy month of Ramadan, he'd finish 2 every single night. Now for us, that's impossible. We're thinking probably how fast did Abu Hanifa read? Right? We're thinking, how fast did Abu Hanifa read? Right? But that's not the point that the ulama make over here. They say that look at the barakah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed in the time of Abu Hanifa. Right? Similar stories are mentioned about the other great imams as well. Right? That hundreds and thousands of times they finished the Holy Quran. And why? And because they were able to finish so much in such a short period of time because Allah put barakah in their time. He says that if you don't spend time doing something good, he says time will pass by and there will be no barakah in your time and time will go. And you won't even realize it. Before you know it, right, you're old, your children are old, right, and you have grandchildren. Right, before you know it, a person now has grandchildren. He says time will pass by like this. And a person will never even realize. And then he says that in the end, a person will say to themselves, right, that it's too late. Now I don't have the strength to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anymore. So he says, فَلَا تَكُنْ كَالْحُمَقَاءِ الَّذِي يَفْرَحُونَ فِي كُلِّ يَوْمٍ بِزِيَادَةِ أَمْوَالِهِمْ مَعَ نُقْصَانِ أَعْمَارِهِمْ. He says that don't be like the foolish people. That every day, they're happy that they've increased their wealth, but they're not sad that their life has been decreased. He goes, don't be like that. He says that don't be so caught up in the dunya that you don't realize that your life is also passing by. So just like you are happy, and just like you are happy that you increased your wealth, he says a person should be sad if the time that's passing by, they're not spending in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are not reciting Quran, they're not performing Salah, they're not coming to the Masjid. A person should be sad. Your time is going. He says that if your time is not being spent in the remembrance of Allah, you should be sad. He says the good person, he says the person who should be happy is the person whose time is going, but it's being spent in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, that person, they should be happy. But at the end of the day, a person should think that how much did I remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala today? How much ibadah did I do? Right, how much Quran did I recite? How much extra salah did I perform? Right, how much did I think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How many sunnah acts did I act upon? And the person should think, right, was my day a good day or was this a bad day? Now Imam Ghazali shows us that look, remember, for a mu'min, the good day is not the day that they made a lot of money. He goes, for the mu'min, the good day is the day that they were able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a lot. That's the good day. He says, فَأَيُّ خَيْرٍ فِي مَالٍ يَزِيدُ وَعُمْرٍ يَنْقُصُ. He goes, what benefit is there in wealth that is increasing, but your life is decreasing? And we see people, right, billionaires right, out there. Right, they have enough money for they themselves to live for the rest of their lives, their children, their children's children, probably for 10 generations. What are they doing? They're still worried about making money, even though they have enough. Even though they have enough. Right? That's just how the dunya is. Right? That when a person, right, gets a taste of this, this temporary sweetness of the dunya, a person just begins following it. It becomes addictive. That we see, right, these people who are, on the top 100 list of the richest people in the entire world. But it's not like they're sitting at home relaxing. It's not like they're sitting at home, maybe even enjoying their lives with their families. They're still working. They're still trying to make more money. Right? So at the end of the day, right, the lesson that can be learned is that money is not bringing them satisfaction. It's not bringing them happiness. They're just wasting every single day of their lives. They're getting older and older. Neither are they spending time with their families. Neither are they worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? They're not getting any closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the day goes on. Right? They're just more worried of getting more and more money. Right? So he says, فَأَيُّ خَيْرٍ فِي مَالٍ يَزِيدُ وَعُمْرٍ يَنْقُصُ. So it's a very good question Imam Ghazali is posing over here. That what benefit is there in wealth that is increasing while your life is decreasing? Right? The very famous hadith, right, that we read the other day after Fajr Salah. 3 things follow a person to their grave, and 2 things will stay in this dunya. They'll come back. They're going to stay in this world. A person's family, a person's wealth, and a person's actions. These 3 things follow them into the grave. What stays here though? Their wealth stays here, their family stays here. Only their a'mal go with them into the hereafter. That's the only thing that matters in the end. That's what he's saying. That spending your life in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the only thing that matters in the end of the day. That's the only way you'll be able to bargain with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment. There's no other currency in the hereafter. It's just your life and your actions. Was your life spent in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Yes, then you'll be able to bargain with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and get yourself into paradise. If your life was spent displeasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you will not be able to bargain with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that day. He says, فَلَا تَفْرَحْ إِلَّا بِزِيَادَةِ عِلْمٍ أَوْ عَمَلٍ. So he says the believer should be happy at what? He says, what should bring joy to the believer? Either amal or ilm. Either increasing themselves in actions, worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or knowledge. He goes, these are the only 2 things that should bring a believer true happiness. Yes, there could be some temporary happiness for other things in life. Right? He's not neglecting that. But he says that at the end of the day, what are the 2 things that are going to benefit the believer the most? It's ilm and amal. It's knowledge and implementing that knowledge. Everything else is temporary, right? Happiness. A person gets a good job, temporary happiness. Right? A person finds a good spouse for their child, again, temporary happiness. All of the happiness of this world is temporary. Why? Because the world is temporary. He says the only way that you'll acquire true happiness is if you increase yourself in your ilm, in your knowledge, or your amal, in your implementation of that knowledge. Because that's the only way. Why? Because that will bring you happiness in the hereafter. And that happiness is not temporary. That happiness will continue on forever. He goes, that's the true happiness. Any happiness in this world is just temporary. He says, فَلَا تَفْرَحْ إِلَّا بِزِيَادَةِ عِلْمٍ أَوْ عَمَلٍ فَإِنَّهُمَا رَفِيقَاكَ يَصْحَبَانِكَ فِي الْقَبْرِ. He says, because these are the only 2 things that will accompany you to your grave, he says. These 2 things will follow you to your grave. Everything else is going to stay in this dunya. Nothing's going to come with you. حَيْثُ يَتَخَلَّفُ عَنْكَ أَهْلُكَ وَمَالُكَ وَوَلَدُكَ وَأَصْدِقَاؤُكَ. This is your friends, your family, your children, your wealth. Everything stays right here. The only piece of this dunya that is going to follow you into the grave is your kafan, your shroud. Right? For men, those 3 pieces of cloth that are on their bodies. For women, those 5 pieces of cloth that are on their body. That's it, nothing else. That's the only thing that's going to follow you into your grave. Right? Those few pieces of cloth. That's the only thing that you have with you in your grave from this dunya. He goes, nothing else. Right? Nothing else. He says, ثُمَّ إِذَا اسْفَرَّتِ الشَّمْسُ. This is Imam Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi just giving you a bit of advice. And now he comes back, right, to the original discussion that he was having, that what should a person do? He says, ثُمَّ إِذَا اسْفَرَّتِ الشَّمْسُ فَاجْتَهِدْ أَن تَعُودَ إِلَى الْمَسْجِدِ قَبْلَ الْغُرُوبِ. He says that when the sun becomes orange, then come to the masjid before the sun sets. Right? And we all know what it means when the sun becomes orange. Around the last 20 minutes of Asr Salah time, the last 20 minutes before sunset, how does the sun become? It becomes a bit orange, to the extent that you can even stare at the sun, it's not going to hurt your eyes. Any other moment of the day, if you look directly at the sun, it will hurt your eyes. But now you could look at the sun. So they call that isfiraru shams. Right? The sun becoming orange, that now it's not going to hurt your eyes. He said at that moment, a person should try their best to come to the masjid and sit inside the masjid. Right? Around 15-20 minutes before Maghrib Salah. He says, وَتَشْتَغِلَ بِالتَّسْبِيحِ وَالْإِسْتِغْفَارِ فَإِنَّ فَضْلَ هَذَا الْوَقْتِ كَفَضْلِ مَا قَبْلَ طُلُوعِ الشَّمْسِ. He says that you should come to the masjid, right? And we established this before, that it is makruh, it's disliked to perform any nawafil at this time. But what else can you do? You can come and you can do some tasbih. Right? You can recite some Quran. And it's very famous that before Maghrib, right, that time is a time when dua is accepted. So a few minutes before Maghrib, you lift your hands and you make dua all the way until the adhan is called. He says, this is what you should do. This is what you should do. He says, because the virtue of the time right before sunset is like the virtue of the time before sunrise. He goes, we told you before that after Fajr Salah until the sun rises, there's a lot of benefit and virtue in that time. He goes, same thing. Right? These last 20 minutes of Asr Salah time, he says, is a very beneficial time. A person should come to the masjid and they should spend that time in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making dua. قال الله عز وجل وَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ قَبْلَ طُلُوعِ الشَّمْسِ وَقَبْلَ غُرُوبِهَا. Right? He quotes the verse of the Holy Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He commands us and He says that praise your Lord, praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before the sun rises and before the sun sets. So these are two times that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to remember Him, wants us to glorify Him. He says, وَقْرَأْ قَبْلَ غُرُوبِ الشَّمْسِ وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى وَالْمُعَوِّذَتَيْنِ. He says that if you are unable to recite any other portion of the Quran, he goes, recite this. Recite وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. What do these two surahs have anything to do with it? وَالشَّمْسِ, we know that the sun is now setting. Shams means sun. So Surah Shams, read the surah that talks about the sun. And then after Surah Shams is Surah Layl. Because now when the sun sets, it's now the night. So you're remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's two bounties and blessings, right? The sun and the night. وَالْمُعَوِّذَتَيْنِ, and you read the two mu'awwidh. Right? Mu'awwidhatayn refers to Surah Falaq and Surah Nas. So read these two. Right? Why? Because they are there to keep us safe, right, from any harmful things. وَلْتَغْرُبْ عَلَيْكَ الشَّمْسُ وَأَنْتَ فِي الْإِسْتِغْفَارِ. He says that what should you be doing while the sun sets? He says you should be doing istighfar, seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. He goes, that's what you should be doing. Meaning, when the sun sets, you should be making dua, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. He goes, that's what you should be doing. So therefore, a person, the last few minutes, they should make dua, and they should do this dua all the way until adhan. So then he says, فَإِذَا سَمِعْتَ الْأَذَانِ فَأَجِبْ. He goes that when you hear the adhan, he says, then respond to the adhan. Right? And then he continues, right, talking about the Maghrib Salah. Right? But inshallah, we'll carry on from there next week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to act upon what said. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah.